皆様、こんばんは。本日はアメリカ大使館主催の英語教授法オンライン研修にご参加いただきありがとうございます。My name is Grace Choi, and I'm an American diplomat at the U.S. Embassy Tokyo working on education and exchanges. I would like to welcome you to today's teacher training session with Jenny Selvidge titled Team Teaching Strategies for JTEs and ALTs. Jenny is joining us today from Kansas City, Missouri in the United States. She's a TESOL expert, and served as the State Department and U.S. Embassy Tokyo sponsored English Language Fellow from July 2019 to March 2020, and was embedded in the Tokyo Metropolitan Board of Education. While here, she provided training to Japanese teachers of English and JET teachers. She's currently teaching ESL classes at Kansas University. Under the circumstances caused by COVID-19, the U.S. Embassy Tokyo will be providing this virtual teacher training seminar series by covering various TESOL topics. I hope you will find this online teacher training series useful in your teaching and that we see you again next time. Thank you and enjoy today's session.
Hey, konbanwa. Hello, everyone. It is good to be with you, even though it's just virtually. As I believe is true, we have both JTEs and ALTs with us today. And if there's something I remember from my time in Tokyo, is that every school is different, and ALTs are all different, and JTEs are often different. So I hope that there is something that you can take from this presentation that will help you, that you can take back to your school and can apply to your specific context. And so let's begin. So in this webinar today, we will focus on addressing both the cultural considerations of team teaching, and I will also present different team teaching scenarios for you. So let's just start with general benefits. So you know this better than I do, but the benefits of utilizing an ALT are many, but one of the major ones is to reduce the teacher-student ratio. The sizes of classes in Japan are not conducive to language learning, as you know. So a class of 40 is very difficult. So having an ALT in your classroom reduces that teacher-student ratio so that you can have more dynamic classes. Also, ALTs help with the communicative approach. So this is a big push in Japan now to have more communicative strategies, and ALTs can help with that, both in implementation and also just in thinking of ideas to have in your class. And of course, they can help students with speaking, right? That's a major benefit of an ALT. And one that I think is not focused on as much is to facilitate cross-cultural understanding. That is another emphasis from the government, from BOEs, is that you want the students to become global citizens. And this is something that can help with that. Maybe the ALT is one of the few foreigners that students ever get to talk to. And so this is a real benefit of having an ALT so that they can interact with a foreigner. They can watch you as a JTE interact with a foreigner, and that can help them to move forward in their international life. So these are all some general benefits, and I'm sure you have others that you could add to this list. So let's talk about some successful scenarios of these partnerships. One is cross-cultural appreciation and flexibility. So when I see partnerships, team teaching partnerships that really value one another's culture, it shows flexibility. They're able to adapt to one another and compromise a little bit in their approaches. And this has been a very successful aspect of team teaching. Also, of course, mutual respect goes into that, both between the JTE and the ALT and students and the ALT. So we always have to remember that students are watching us, right? And so when they see the JT and the ALT really respect one another and really value each other's culture, students pick up on that, and they could also show that kind of respect. I think it's also important, though, that when students don't show respect, that JTEs notice that and address it. So mutual respect is a really important component. Also, clearly defined roles. So when both the JTE and the ALT know their role in the classroom in any given day, that is a really successful aspect of it. And then regular communication. So when they find a way to communicate about what they're doing in class, and also frequent feedback about how things are going or maybe how things need to change a little bit. And then finally, if the ALT could have a consistent time with the same JTE in the same class, that is most helpful. I know it's not always possible, but so often I would see ALTs just go around to different classes every week. They would be in a different class. And so you don't have time to build rapport and to build that relationship with the JTE and with the students. So if possible, if the ALT could be with the same teacher, the same class for a period of time, maybe a month at a time or whatever, that would really be helpful. So let's begin with the cultural aspect. So often we talk about this image. So we see the small iceberg on the top, but what we don't see is the giant iceberg beneath the surface. And so this is a lot of times how culture works. So maybe there's something happening that we can see, there's a misunderstanding or a miscommunication or some conflict of some kind. What we don't think about is why it's happening. And a lot of times it comes down to culture. So I'm speaking as an American that lived in Japan for a little while. And I can tell you from my experience that the American culture and the Japanese culture are very different. And so there were often times where it just didn't seem to mesh very well because they're so different. And so we really need to address it and to note it so that we can move forward positively. So one of the ways that I think we need to think about culture is with communication. And forgive me if I make some assumptions that aren't true, but in Japan, it seems like the communication is more indirect. And my Japanese colleagues would tell me about the idea of reading the air. And that is something that I could not do very well. I tried so hard to read the air to kind of get a sense of what was really happening, but it was very difficult for me because in my culture, communication is more direct. Not always, but it's definitely more direct. And when there's conflict, it's addressed, especially in a workplace environment. And so that difference is very significant. But I think what's very important to note is that neither culture's style of communication is right or wrong. Neither one is right or wrong. There's no one right way to communicate. But I think it's important to note the differences and to find some compromise and to find some middle ground. So I would encourage you, when possible, to explain things as directly as you can, just to try to avoid any miscommunication or conflict. So speaking of communication, I have some quotes from a JTE and an ALT partnership. So this is from a JTE. For every lesson, before and after, we have a brief discussion on the lesson. We talk about how the lesson will be managed and what are the weaknesses of the students. We frequently change the emphasis on the activities according to the previous class's performance, even if we do the same lesson. So there are some things I really like about this quote. First of all, every lesson before and after, we have a brief discussion. That's so important to have a check-in conversation about what's going to happen in that lesson, in that class. And also this part, we frequently change the emphasis on the activities according to the previous class's performance. So we have to adapt our lessons based on how our students do. We can't plan our lessons ahead of time and just do them as we plan them. We have to adapt according to what the students do, whether they understand it or not. And so having communication between you can help with that. So some takeaways from this comment. Regular communication led to a more dynamic classroom. And both parties adapted to meet the students' needs. And they were on the same page. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but they both knew what was going to happen. So it wasn't that one was just kind of wondering what's going to happen today. They were both on the same page from the start. Let's hear from the ALT in that partnership. I took my work very seriously and make sure to communicate directly with the JTEs to ensure that my activities addressed their teaching goals. I even went as far as to create small lesson plans so that even if the JTE didn't have time to immediately discuss the plan, they could read the document on their own and share their thoughts when most convenient. So there's a lot of good things in this one too. The first one, she wanted to ensure that her activities addressed the teaching goals. So if you've been with me in other webinars, we always have to start with our teaching goals, our objectives. And so she wanted to connect with that. She went ahead and created small lesson plans just to help. She did that on her own. And also she acknowledged that the JTE was very busy. So she found a way to communicate those lesson plans when it was convenient for the JTE. So some takeaways from this comment. The ALT aligned with the JTE's goals. So the JTE has goals and the ALT came alongside that. The ALT, she took initiative. She saw something that she could do and she went ahead and did it. You have to, do it appropriately. You don't want to overstep, but she went ahead and did what she thought she could to help. And she also recognized the JTE's busy schedule. Japanese teachers are so busy during the day. I saw this time and time again. And so it's important to note that and find a way to still communicate even with the busy schedule. So let's talk about how to plan together. Ideally, class objectives are set. As I said, this is always my first and most important way to start. What are the objectives? What are the goals? If you have time to sit down together and plan together, if that's what you want to do, that's great. Or the JTE needs to set that and make that known. You need to plan or meet before class. You need to decide on the roles that both will play in that class. And you need a post-class discussion. So this seems like a lot, and I know people are thinking, I don't have time for all of that. This process does not have to take a lot of time. This could actually be a few minutes. And as you do it more, and as you get to know one another and you set your routine, this could be very quick. But all of this needs to be done. You need to be on the same page here. So for objectives, it helps both the JTE and ALT know the role they need to play. Sometimes I would see ALTs with complete freedom to plan a lesson and to teach the lesson, and that's great if that's what you want to do. But when I would talk to the ALT, I asked, what was your objective? That was always the question I asked them anytime I went to a class, and they could never really tell me. So the JTE needs to make that clear for them so that they're just not planning some nice activities, that they're going in a direction. So the JTE still needs to be driving the bus and make the objective clear for the ALT, even if they have complete freedom to plan a lesson. We always need to have that objective clear. So planning ahead of time. As I mentioned, you are all very busy people, but find a system that works for you and prioritize communication with each other. So at the beginning of the year, decide what way works best for you. Maybe it's 5 minutes before or after class. Maybe you say, let's meet at the teacher's room and let's walk together to class and we'll talk in that time. It's not ideal because you're busy and you're saying hello to students, but if that's what works for you, then definitely that's one option. Maybe Line is a good option for you, or Facebook. I know that a lot of ALTs communicated with their JTEs through Facebook Messenger. Or if you have access to email, that could be another way. Maybe you have a Google Doc, so you can both add ideas to the same document, those live documents. OneNote is another option too. Or maybe you have a place in the teacher's room, a physical place where always the lesson is there. So maybe the JTE might make some notes and leave it for the ALT. vice versa. So maybe you have a spot on the teacher's desk where you know you're going to leave communication with each other. Whatever works for you, just decide what that is and move forward. So both people need to have a clear idea of what their roles are in the class. The JTE is the lead teacher here for many, many reasons. They're the expert, right, of Japanese education. The JTE knows the context. It took a lot of conversations and a lot of visits to schools for me to even start to understand the context of Japanese schools. And the JTE knows all of that. So they know what needs to happen, or they know the boundaries, or they know the expectations from the principal or the BOE. So they know what needs to happen. But the ALT brings so many strengths. One of them is a background in communicative classrooms. So even if the ALT is not a trained teacher, they were students. Most likely, I know they're from many countries, but most likely in a place that had a very communicative style of education. So as students, they can think back to different things that they did in their classrooms. So they would be a great resource for brainstorming. What do you think would be good in this? How could we add some more communicative activities here? And ALTs were all different, but the one thing they all had in common that I observed was a strong desire to be useful. So I think, you know, coming from my perspective also, we go to Japan and we're ready to help, and sometimes we might get a little frustrated when we're not doing anything to help. And so I think that can be very frustrating for people if, you know, they really want to be useful and they're not being used. So use them. JTEs, ALTs and JETs are such a huge resource for Japan, and oftentimes I saw them not being utilized, which is such a waste. So please find ways to make them useful. And ALTs join that conversation as well. Post-class evaluation. Again, this could take 2 or 3 minutes. It doesn't have to take a long time. It doesn't have to be formal or anything. But why is it important to do this? You need to identify what went well and what didn't, so you can have that dynamic lesson planning. So you need to say, oh, that activity really didn't go very well. I thought it would. Why didn't it? And you can talk together about why you think it didn't go well. You can discuss any problems or questions, and to plan for that next class so that you can adapt, like that JTE mentioned, so that you could have that dynamic classroom. And ultimately, to help the students. That's your ultimate goal, right? To make the classes as dynamic as possible. So having that 2-3 minute conversation. If you have more time, of course, more time is better to sit down with a cup of tea in the teacher's room to talk about it, but you might not have that time. So let's talk about some different team teaching approaches. Before I go into the different approaches, I want to mention something first about types of classes. So you could have a JTE centered class, or sometimes I see a class that's completely ALT centered. You could also have a collaborative class. So I want to ask you some rhetorical questions that you just think about on your own. Which is the best type? Are there times when one is a better option than the others? Can you use a mix of the three? So my answers to these questions are, there is no best type. There are times when one is a better option than the others. For example, when it gets close to time for those high school students to really focus on preparation for the entrance exam, most likely it would be a very JTE-centered class, right? Maybe you're really doing a interactive speaking activity, so maybe you have an ALT-centered class. Or maybe you do a mix, and maybe you have more collaborative approaches. What I want to emphasize here is that every class does not need to be collaborative if it doesn't fit your goal. Again, you have to go back. What is our goal today? and what's the best approach for us to take? Okay, so I want to give you a little bit of freedom to feel okay if it is JTE centered or if it is ALT centered. So think about that accordingly based on your goals of your class. Okay, here are 6 team teaching approaches, and I'm going to go into more detail on 5 of them. So 1 teach, 1 observe, 1 teach, 1 assist, parallel teaching, station teaching, alternative teaching, and team teaching. The one that I'm not going to focus on today is number 5, alternative teaching. This talks about when maybe an ALT would help a specific group of students who have maybe some special needs. And from what I remember and observed, I believe you have special aids for those students. So I don't know if ALTs are used in this capacity. So I'm not going to go into much detail about the 5th one. Okay, so let's start here with 1 teach, 1 observe. One thing I want to mention is all of these types are active. Both people, both teachers are actively engaged. There is not one of these where one sits back and doesn't do anything. So even in observation, they're actively engaged. So in this first one, 1 teach, 1 observe, the one not teaching is actively observing. By what I mean by that is maybe when you had your conversation before class, you identified something that you want someone to look for. So maybe, you know, sometimes in our classes, we have 1 or 2 students that are kind of the leaders, and maybe sometimes they're not leading in a positive way. So maybe say, I really want you to watch so-and-so and see what we can do to help put them in the right direction. Or maybe you're trying a new teaching strategy and you want the person to observe how the students are responding. So you're observing with a purpose. The second one is pretty self-explanatory. The person not teaching is circulating around the class and helping as necessary. The next one, parallel teaching. Parallel, you're in the same direction, right? So this is when you would divide the class into 2 groups, and each of you teach the same content to both groups. So the benefit here is that you're teaching to a smaller number of students. So instead of 40, you're each teaching to 20. Of course, you would need the space to do this. Sometimes rooms you're not able to move the chairs, so I don't know if there's another room or another space. Maybe the conversation group room, I don't know how that works, but you would have to have the space to do this. I did see a class in Japan use this, and it was very effective. Station teaching is similar, where you divide the class, but the teachers are teaching something different with the different groups, and then they switch at the end or in the middle. And then the last one is that tag teaching, where they really are teaching together, back and forth, back and forth. So let's look at some lesson plans and how this would look in an actual class. So let's look at this grammar lesson. Let's say you're teaching the present perfect. So you would start with a whole group discussion to the whole class, getting them warmed up. What are some exciting things you have done in your life? And the students can jump in and give some answers. And then maybe the JTE spends time teaching the target grammar structures. So gives examples of sample sentences using the question and short answer form. Then we want to do some application activities. So the students get into small groups to practice asking questions and giving short answers using that target grammar present perfect structure. And the ALT circulates around the room. So a couple of different options. The ALT observes. They look and see what's going on, how the students are doing. If they're really understanding the question form, maybe they're getting a piece of the form wrong. Maybe they keep making the same mistakes. So you're kind of a little spy for the JTE, and you can make note of the mistakes the students are making and report back to the JTE. So you can just walk around them and maybe say, hey, they're really struggling with this. Then the JTE can use that information to address the whole group again. So maybe before you end the class, you bring everyone back together and the JTE says, hey, we've noticed that you're struggling with this. Let's go over that again. And you can do a little bit of reteaching. This is a good option if you don't want to stop the students' flow of speaking. You just want to observe and let them talk. Also, if you went to my previous webinar about correction, maybe your students don't respond well to subtle correction in the moment. Maybe they're really shy and you don't want to embarrass them. This would be a good way, instead of saying, oh, you made a mistake, report the mistakes back from the whole class to the teacher, and the teacher can address the whole class. Or the ALT can assist. Circulate, listen for mistakes, and can give that subtle correction to the students in the moment if it's appropriate. And again, that depends on if you want students to be corrected as they're speaking or not. And that's a choice that you can make depending on your students. Let's talk about this same lesson plan with a different approach. So you do your whole group discussion, then the JTE teaches the target grammar to everyone, and then you divide the students into two groups. One goes with the JTE and one goes with the ALT. Let's do some station teaching. Okay, so one person has group one, and maybe these students are doing a speaking activity. So for example, in a circle, the teacher begins by asking questions to the student next to him or her, and that student gives a short answer, and then that student asks the person next to them, and so on and so forth. And while students are in that circle, the teacher is listening to what students are doing and can give subtle correction if that fits for your students. So again, you have fewer students, and so the teacher can really see what's happening, and students have more of an opportunity to speak. When they're in a class of 40, they might speak once in a class or twice. So this gives them more chance to speak. Meanwhile, in the other group, the other teacher might work on a writing task. So maybe students are filling in missing blanks in a dialogue with the present perfect. The teacher can circulate, check on students' work, and can give feedback, and maybe they can really help one specific student who's not understanding the material. So again, that smaller group allows for the teacher to know how students are doing and also to give targeted instruction to students. So let's say, you have a 50-minute class, maybe you do each of these for 20 minutes. So after the first 20 minutes, you switch, and maybe the teachers switch so students don't have to move around. And then by the end of the class, they have done both a speaking activity and a writing task. Let's switch the lesson. Let's talk about writing for a minute. So maybe your lesson is about writing topic sentences. Parallel teaching would be a great option here, where again, you split your class, but instead of doing different stations, you do the exact same lesson. So I would say at the beginning of the class, you split them up, and then you do the following lesson. You have a warm-up. What do you think about anime? You can pick any topic that you think might be interesting for the students. And then you do some chatting. And then you teach the purpose of the topic sentence and how to write one. You'll talk about, how to move from a topic to a topic sentence. You'll really give them some examples. You'll maybe give them 3 topics, like K-pop, for example. And you'll show them how to move from a topic sentence, or from a topic to a topic sentence. So you give them some examples, you do it together. And then you might give students 2 or 3 topics and have them practice it on their own. And then you can help them, give them assistance and direction. So why parallel teach for this? Because topic sentences, from what I observed in Japan, are extremely challenging for students. So when you have a really challenging topic, you want to have a higher teacher-student ratio or a lower teacher-student ratio. You want to be able to work with students more one-on-one if possible. So when you divide the class, you have that teacher-student time. Students can ask questions. Maybe they're a little more brave to ask a question than they would be in a class of 40. And then the teacher can see how students are doing. And then of course, how students are doing can help you plan the next class. You know, I saw some teachers teach topic sentences one day and then they moved on the next class. Most likely they're going to need some more practice. So if you can really know how they did with it, you can adapt and see, what do we need to do in the next class? You could do it for reading. Here's another lesson idea. So when you're talking about a difficult reading for the first time, so for example, a biology reading, team teaching would be a nice option here. So the JTE and the ALT are addressing the whole class together. Of course, you would need to have the conversation ahead of time with each other about how you're going to do the class. So you would really need to prioritize communication, especially when you're doing this tag teaching model. So you might need to sit down and have a 20-minute conversation instead of 2 minutes walking to class. So maybe the warm-up. What do you know about biology? And students can discuss this in English with some Japanese if it's necessary. Why? Because when they know about biology in Japanese, right? Most likely. And so what they're really learning is not about biology, but how to talk about biology in English. So using some Japanese words as they're trying to first engage with the reading is just fine. Maybe the ALT then reads the section of a text in English. And then while they do that, maybe the JTE jumps in every once in a while to add some vocabulary help. Maybe say, oh, you know that word in Japanese? No, it's this. Or if there's a really difficult idea, the JTE can jump in and do a little bit of an explanation. So it really is a dynamic back and forth. And then you would have, of course, some application options after that. Maybe students discuss the reading or answer comprehension questions, write a response. So why team teach here? To clarify new or difficult ideas with Japanese help. So, you know, a lot of times teachers ask me, can I use Japanese in the classroom? Definitely, if you think it'll help. I mean, you're working toward the goal of more English, but when students are first engaging with a topic and building the vocabulary and building their knowledge about it, it's okay to clarify things. It's better that you're clarifying in Japanese than for them to just translate, because those are not reliable. So team teaching might be a good option here. Okay, I think we're close to wrapping up, but I think what's really important is that you start well in your professional relationship. So what do I mean by that? So I would recommend that you start the school year on a positive note. You may have a brief meet and greet event where JTEs and ALTs can meet one another. It's really good to have that time because there are often many JTEs in the English department, right? In high schools at least. And so the ALTs can learn faces and learn names and vice versa. And, you know, returning ALTs, if you have ALTs that aren't new, they can join in as well so that everyone can kind of get to know one another. In a previous webinar, I talked about the classroom activity of speed dating. It's not about dating at all. But maybe you could practice this with your teachers so that they can learn it and use it with their students. But you could all sit facing each other and you could have a timer where you have 3 minutes to chat with each other and then the timer goes off and you move one seat over. So by the end of 15 minutes, 20 minutes, everyone has had a conversation. This helps to break the ice, as we say, and to help get to know one another, which I think is a really important foundation for that. Maybe you already do that. And then at the beginning of a team teaching partnership, so as I know, ALTs move around to different teachers. Before you start working together, maybe it's the middle of the year and you have a new ALT working with you, spend more time than just 2 minutes before you go to class. Spend some time talking together about expectations. about what you need from each other, especially what the JTE needs from the ALT. And then the ALT can share what they could bring to the class. So I suggest for this conversation going through a few questions, and these are a few suggestions. Of course, you can adapt as you need. But I would ask JTEs something, or ALTs something like this. Why did you want to be an ALT in Japan? What are your goals for your time here? As we know, ALTs are all different. Some want to come to Japan because they want to learn how to teach and they want to practice teaching. And so they really are interested in teaching strategies and becoming better teachers. That, if you know that, that helps you in your relationship. Maybe you can give them a little bit more responsibility in the class. Some ALTs also, they want to be immersed in Japanese culture and they're really interested in just really understanding Japanese culture. That's great too. There are different kinds of ALTs, and knowing that, I did hear a lot of JTEs talk about ALTs and compare them to my last ALT. Oh, they're not like my last one. ALTs are all different, and so you need to take the person that is there and take their strengths. And so knowing what their goals and strengths are at the beginning is helpful. Another question I'd ask is what their experience is with teaching English. If they have some experience, get to know what kind. Have they taught a writing class? Have they taught a speaking class? What has their experience been so far? Because that could help you say, oh, you already know how to teach writing. Great, I need help. Maybe you could work with this teacher for a while. So if you're the head of an English department, it would be good to know these things. If they're not experienced teachers, then maybe you want to know, are you interested in learning how to teach? Because that changes your relationship a little bit. And then asking for the ALT's opinion about what do you think your strengths are that could help in my classroom. So I saw a lot of ALTs and they were all different, and some were just really good at maybe creating games. I saw one ALT that had really wonderful games and that was her strength. I saw another ALT that was really creative, even in his dress and his style of teaching, and that is good too in a different way. And so everyone brings their strengths, and it's good to know up front how the ALT views their strengths that they can bring to the relationship, to the partnership. And also JTEs, I think it would be helpful to share the following things with the ALT. The role you want them to play. And it depends on your class, right? If it's a freshman class, it's going to be very different than if it's a class of 12th graders, right? So you may want to be very specific about the role you want them to play. Like, do you want them to really just do more speaking? Do you want them to help them with their critical thinking? What is it that you want them to do? And how do you hope they will help your students? So maybe your students are painfully shy and you really hope that they help build confidence in the students. Maybe that's the goal. And then, as I've mentioned a couple of times, share with them how you will communicate and how often. So maybe it's in person on that walk to class. Maybe it's through Line. Maybe it's via Facebook. And maybe it's every Monday you want to meet at the beginning of the school day or at the end of the school day or before or after class. So both of you can then know this is what we're going to do. So I would recommend something like this. Of course, adapt it as is beneficial for you. So some final thoughts here. So for JTEs, try to be as direct as you can, as is comfortable with the ALT. They're used to it, most likely. Of course, be kind, but I often wish when I was in Japan, so many times I felt so confused about what was going on, and I kept thinking, I wish someone would just tell me what's going on. So luckily I had Japanese colleagues who were my safe people who I could say, okay, this is what's happening, what is going on? And they were more direct. So if you could find a way to do that, that would be helpful if possible. Establish regular communication. I know I've said that 5,000 times. Set your objectives and how you want to utilize the ALT. And then model those positive cross-cultural interactions. Again, the students are watching. You may be the only cross-cultural interaction that they see, you know, watching a Japanese person and a foreigner work together. So it's really important. I mean, you've probably got 120 pairs of eyes watching you. So model that positive cross-cultural interaction. Ask each other about culture and how do you do that here? How does that work back where you're from? Things like that. So model that for your students. ALTs, take initiative when you can and when it's appropriate. Don't, you know, barge in or don't assert yourself too forcefully if you feel like it doesn't fit. Try to read the air a little bit with that, but take initiative when you can. And like that ALT did, she just kind of left them for the JTE if they could use it. Be patient. If you're not being used in the way you want, you know, try to communicate, but also be patient. Know yourself and do a little bit of reflection before you start. What strengths do you bring to a classroom? And also, when we jump into living abroad, part of the deal is doing things we're not always comfortable in. And that's the good stuff, right, about living abroad. So try to be okay doing things like, no, I'm actually more of a speaking teacher. I'm not a good writing teacher. Try it. You know, you just jump in where you think you're needed. And for everyone, be aware of that cultural iceberg under the surface. So I'm sure most of the time there's something going on culturally if you're having some miscommunication or some kind of problem there. So these are my suggestions to you. It's not always easy to team teach, so I know it's a challenging thing, but it also is so rewarding and it can be so beneficial for your students. I have a resource here. This PowerPoint will be available later, so you can check out this article if you'd like. All right, so it's question time. So please use the Q&A button, not the chat, the Q&A button to ask your questions. And please write your questions in English. My Japanese is terrible, so please write them in English. And then before you go, you have that short survey that we would really appreciate if you could complete. Okay. So if you have any questions, please write them down. Okay, we've got one. I was a teacher at an elementary school until last year. Some teachers don't have time to discuss the lessons. However, I understand how important it is to have time. So what should teachers do? Just as I mentioned in the presentation, you need to find a way that works. So if you can't do it in person, do it by line, do it by line chat. You could do it by Facebook. You can, if they have access to email, I know that not everyone does, do it by email. Or as I mentioned, you could have a physical document that's a conversation, or a Google Doc is really great. If you're not using Google Docs, I recommend it. So I really think it's important to find another way, because I know that you don't have time, but you need to find a way to discuss it. So Line, Facebook, something else. Should we talk to the ALT in Japanese? If the ALT speaks Japanese, sure, yeah, why not? If it works for both parties, as long as there's not miscommunication. If the ALT is so in Japanese and you speak to them in Japanese, you risk having them misunderstand you. So yeah, if both are very fluent, yeah, why not? It's great. Or maybe you mean in the classroom. I'm not sure if you mean in the classroom or just in general. Okay, which is better, ALT talks more or JTE? Always my answer is it depends. It depends on the goal of the class. So if your goal is for like cross-cultural communication, you want them to talk about what life is like in Australia or something, great. If it's a more difficult topic where you need some Japanese instruction, maybe the JTE. It depends on the class and the lesson that you're doing. Okay, Japanese students are shy to speak English. What would you suggest to encourage them to speak out? I, in previous webinars, I've talked about this. I would utilize technology. So I would use things like Flipgrid, where they respond to a question and it's only you and them. And the ALT is really a good option for looking at these and grading these. But when the student is only, recording a video on their phone, they know that only the teacher is listening. So they don't have to worry about maybe making a mistake in front of their friends or anything like that. So I would suggest utilizing these technology resources. In the classroom, I would really encourage you to try to reduce the teacher-student ratio so that they aren't talking in front of 40 people. So if you could have smaller groups, then that would be helpful. My ALT always prepares well and hard for students. Yeah. So there are some really, really fantastic ALTs out there for sure. I'm glad that you have that. Which one did you do most? Team teaching, station teaching, or parallel teaching, and why? So the reasons that I mentioned in the presentation would be the why. So I use a mix. I love the station teaching and the parallel teaching, but you have to really trust that the ALT can understands how to teach that topic. So if you do have a great ALT that could really do well with teaching, I would suggest doing that because you're reducing the teacher-student ratio. And so I would recommend that for difficult topics that you really want them to understand. I would do team teaching for difficult topics where you need some Japanese help with Japanese instruction. I'm working at an elementary school. Our ALT consists her way of teaching. She gets angry if we want to change her plan. She can speak Japanese very well. She doesn't like HRTs, homeroom teachers, doing lessons by themselves because of their pronunciations are bad. Yeah, that's a problem that I, if this were the United States, and I know it's not, but that's when the principal would need, from my perspective, someone needs to jump in and talk to the ALT about their professionalism. It needs to be a team teaching. So that is a very difficult situation. Sounds like she wants to be the lead teacher. So that is some interpersonal discussions that maybe the principal or someone higher up needs to have with that person. I'm sorry you're having that situation. That's really difficult. I'm a first-year elementary ALT. I've been placed in a rural part of Japan where there's a steep language barrier. I don't have any Japanese experience and my JTEs know as much English as the kids do. Any tips to mitigate this? I mean, I'm sure you're using Google Translate. That is tough, especially in those rural areas. I wonder if you have anyone that speaks Japanese in your life somewhere else? Probably not. Here is where I would probably just adjust my expectations to be very small. So your goals in helping would be, try to speak as short of a way as possible. So, if you're talking about greetings, if you could find some Google Translate a way to say, I want to help with greetings. Can I help? I mean, I'm sure you're doing anything that I would do. That's really difficult. I think I would, for you, adjust your expectations about how much you're really going to get done in that situation. And work on your Japanese. I'm sorry, I don't have anything more, but I think adjusting your expectations, there's only so much you can do in that situation. I have a JTE with whom I try to talk about classes, but she doesn't understand my English and doesn't understand even when I explain in Japanese. I'm often confused about what she's doing in class. Do you have any advice on how to deal with this kind of JTE? Yeah. The language barrier is a significant challenge. My only advice here would try to narrow in on the objective of the class And so if you could somehow with the translation, what is the goal of the class? And if you could do this ahead of time, so there's time for both of you to go back and do some translation. And what do you want me to do? So 2 questions. What is the goal? And what do you want me to do in this class? And I know you're probably already doing that. Good luck. Thank you. ALT and JTE communication. Your JTE means not classroom teacher, or do you mean classroom teacher? By the JTE, I mean the Japanese teacher, the Japanese classroom teacher. So you have the Japanese teacher, and then you have the JET or the ALT. So that's what I mean by JTE, Japanese teacher. Okay, I'm thinking of organizing a language exchange between ALT and students. Could you suggest any ideas of a successful language exchange or communication among students and ALT? Yeah, so I would definitely encourage you to think about topics that students are interested in, because if they're not interested in the topics, it's not going to be something they want to participate in. And so if you have a couple of students that you could really pick their brain and get some brainstorming about what topics that they would like or what they would like to see from that exchange, utilize your students and get ideas from them. And just try to make it as fun as possible and not academic. I would not make it academic at all. Make it fun. Because that way they are more apt to do it, and they also have more language about things they know about. Sometimes JTs hesitate to tell ALTs what they expect because it might be too much for them or hurt them. Is it okay to tell them clearly, or should we? Yes, I would say so. Maybe some of the ALTs are saying no, but most likely ALTs come from a culture that is used to direct communication. One thing I do want to mention is that I have seen sometimes when the Japanese teachers put too much on the ALTs and they expect them to do too much. That is not possible. And so I really do want you to be aware of the workload you're putting on the ALT, because it might be too much. And so that's where, getting to know each other and having a strong professional relationship would be a good foundation for ALTs to feel comfortable saying, I would love to do that, but I don't feel like I can do all of that. So there needs to be a relationship where you can honestly talk together about what you're asking the ALTs to do. I have seen times where the Japanese teacher asked ALTs to do something that was not realistic and was just overburdened the ALT. And so you need to be realistic and give space for the ALT to share their feelings about it. When the ALT is so stubborn and does not have ears to listen and nobody can communicate, what can the JT do? Nothing. So some of these problems are interpersonal problems, like you just have a difficult person. So I would maybe have the principal talk to them and have a direct conversation with them. Or if they're a JET, if you can talk to a supervisor about it. So I would be as direct as possible about how it's going, give them feedback and say, this is not going well, and this is why. And we want to talk to you about how to move forward to make this a better working relationship. So again, honest, direct communication is one way to move forward. Working time of ALT is stated in the contract. I wonder if it's okay to communicate with the ALT using Line or Facebook. Doesn't it mean to work overtime? That depends on your BOE, that depends on your situation, your principal, and that's where I think you need to talk from the beginning, at the beginning of the year. So look at their contract, look at how much time. Maybe you agree on the hours in which you communicate. And so you say, I will communicate with you by line, but only between the hours of 8 and 6. I don't know. But have those boundaries that go in line with their hours in the contract. So it depends on your situation, whether it's okay or not, But again, that's where I would just set boundaries about what you're going to do. Many JTEs ask ALT too many jobs, like checking students' writing. Yes, I want to share those jobs with ALT evenly. Okay, this is exactly the situation that I saw. JTE asked an ALT to grade, I think it was 300 papers, and it wasn't realistic. And the thinking of the Japanese teacher was good. She wanted one person to grade all of them so that it was graded in the same way. But the problem is, if someone grades 300 papers, they are not going to grade the first 10 in the same way they're going to grade the last 10, because they're going to be exhausted. So this is where you need to do what we call calibration. So you have a clear rubric of how you're going to grade the writing, and you have it, it's going to take a little bit of time, but you sit down with everyone and you have maybe 1 or 2 sample writing assignments from students, and everybody grades it, and you talk about the score you gave, and you talk, if there's discrepancy, if you graded it differently, you talk about why. And one person, the lead teacher, needs to say, okay, we're going to grade it this way, and this is why. And so you need to calibrate so that you're on the same page. It's not perfect, of course, but that would be my suggestion, to have a clear rubric and talk together with a couple of student sample writings about how to grade it. Okay, we have 2 minutes, so let me see. Why do Japanese teachers push for good pronunciation? The teachers have pushed me to be voice recorders, yes, but I have strongly suggested that I feel ineffective. I agree with you. Yeah, I don't know why Japanese teachers push for good pronunciation. I think it's just wanting to be as good as possible. So I think the intention is good. However, I agree. And so Japanese teachers hear me when I say pronunciation is not as important as confidence and thinking about your answers and giving responses that you think about instead of just repeating things. I would encourage you to stop using your ALTs as a tape recorder, because they could be used in a much more dynamic way to help with small groups, to help with authentic speaking tasks. Pronunciation is only important if you cannot understand what they're saying, but pronunciation should not be your main focus. So I agree with you. I think what you're saying and what you're suggesting to the JTE is good. So yeah, I think we should focus less on pronunciation. Okay, JTE speaks a lot in Japanese. How can you let them speak more English? That's probably not your job, because you are the subordinate. So I think if you could take initiative and say, hey, I have a few speaking ideas that I would love to help with. Do you think that I could do any of these with the students, or just try to take some gentle initiative on offering some alternatives of ways that you can contribute to the lesson? I teach at a junior high school. How do I go about trying to correct pronunciation of the JTE in the most considerate way possible? I would stay away from that. So you could do, if you looked at my previous webinar of recasting, where they say something and you repeat it in the correct way, so that you're not overtly correcting them, but that you're repeating it. And, you know, over time, if you're more comfortable, they might ask you for help, but I wouldn't give them pronunciation help unless they ask for it. I would recast it. I would always repeat it in the correct way and leave it at that. Okay. Okay, we are out of time, but there are so many good questions here. I'm sorry that I can't get to all of the questions, but maybe there's a way that we can address some of these questions at a later time. Maybe we can post it on the website. But thank you so much for coming. I hope something was helpful for both the Japanese teachers and the ALTs. I think what you're doing is so important. And so I hope that, that I wish you well as you strive for more dynamic team teaching. Thank you so much for coming.